This conversation is Navigating the Nexus, Progress and Artificial Intelligence. It's a conversation between Hilary Harper and Kate Mildenhall. Kate Mildenhall is the author of 3 acclaimed novels, Skylarking, The Mother Fault, and just in August this year, The Hummingbird Effect, which has already garnered incredible praise. Each of Kate's novels has been lavished, I would say, with almost unseemly praise, but I think that is right and proper. And Kate is in conversation with Hilary Harper. Hilary Harper is a voice that we all recognise. She has been a radio presenter for 30 years. Wow. And has been at the ABC since 2005. She is currently the presenter with Beverly Wang of the long-running Life Matters on Radio National. She's also a writer and book nerd who dreams one day of having a sufficient number of bookshelves. So please make them welcome.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I would also like to acknowledge the first storytellers on this land, the Gunditjmara people of the Eastern Maar, and their ongoing connection to the land and the waters here, because their narratives have shaped this country for millennia and continue to do so. And I hope we can continue that tradition today. As you heard, Kate Mildenhall is a writer and a teacher. Her novels are Skylarking, very beautiful and haunting, and The Mother Fault and The Hummingbird Effect, which practically read themselves. I just zoomed through them. It's like, this is not even research. I just inhaled them. And they raise quite a few issues about how we relate to each other in the digital age and where we're headed. Kate, hello.
Hi.
Hi.
This chair is so comfortable. I'm just going to say, I thought that we were going to have to bring some energy to match that fabulous performance just then. And now I'm feeling quite chill here. Do excuse us.
I need a martini, frankly. Though that's quite a contrast to the quite tight control that happens over people, in particularly the Hummingbird Effect and the Mother Fault, and the surveillance and the constraints on their bodies and their time. Is this something that you fear or something that you see?
Oh, that's a great spot to start. I think particularly with the Mother Fault, I was concerned with paying attention. And the same in the Hummingbird Effect. I think that's what writers do across the board is to just gently. I heard Hayley Scrivener talk about gentle curiosity today, and that gentle kind of motioning to have a look at this thing that interests me. I think the thing with surveillance, so I wrote The Mother Fault before the pandemic, did not intend for it to come out. It's a book where kids are chipped or everyone is chipped. They get a little chip in their hand that makes life easier, right? Like using your phone to pay for things. Like you can get into your door and do all those other things, but of course everyone can see where you are at all times. The fact that book came out and then we went into lockdown in Victoria, and I had phrases in that book like, we get a chip because we're all in this together, from the premiere was relatively spooky. And there was a sense of some kind of fear, I think, at that stage. The tech stuff in the Hummingbird Effect, I think less fear, more curiosity. Like, what is this stuff? What's it doing? What's its potential? And what are the potential pitfalls? That's
really interesting, because I felt in The Mother Fault the technology was frightening because it was wielded by terrifying people. Yes. Whereas in The Hummingbird Effect, it felt like the technology itself was a potential threat. Is that how you feel?
Yeah, you're smart and very good. Yes, I think that is true. And the technology in the Hummingbird Effect goes from the technology that comes in 1933, which is the chain system of slaughtering that comes into an abattoir, where slaughtermen have previously just been using their hands to do the work, up until the technology that happens in 2031, the idea of an AI or an algorithm, and then this post-collapse kind of anti-technology, which happens in the far future.
Yeah, and it's tied up with ideas about efficiency and convenience, isn't it? It's like the things that we want. What are we prepared to put up with to get the things that we want?
Yeah, and this is the thing. I don't know how many of you in the audience have this feeling all the time, that it's like, yeah, of course, no one's looking at me. I'll give Facebook all my details and I'll give my email out if it means that I can read the free article from the New Yorker every once in a while, and I'll, do all of those things because we think that it's not necessarily going to impact us. It's not going to impact me. But the idea of where that data goes, and if we don't pay attention to what we're giving up, what does that mean? They're the questions that I think I'm most curious to answer or to think about.
Well, there's this scene in The Hummingbird Effect in the kind of not too distant future where Kat and La would like to have a baby, or Kat would like to have a baby and La's kind of thinking about it. But to do that, La needs to join this workforce that can get her these benefits, and she needs to read through this giant screed of terms and conditions, and she's skimming it, and I'm going, please stop and read it before you sign it. I could barely stand to watch.
Yeah, and this is another thing that came across from The Mother Fault, because in The Mother Fault, I ended up putting in the epigraph something from a Netflix documentary, which was this idea of we didn't stop to read the terms and conditions. And what La is doing is something that is happening. This is I've pitched it into 2031, but it's happening now. This idea that women particularly will be offered employment packages which give them access to egg freezing. That seems relatively smart. You can join, you can work for a bit longer. We'll help you freeze your eggs and we'll help pay for that. But some of the things that have started coming up around that are, well, what happens if I get fired? Or what happens to my eggs if I am part of a union movement that potentially sabotages my work? What happens then? And so these are the kind of questions that are being asked. I don't have any answers. I mean, I think writers of fiction really do have answers, but they're things that were starting to really turn the cogs of my mind.
I feel like there are some pretty solid points being made here. I mean, they're couched as questions, but I really feel like there are points of view being solidly foregrounded, and without risking a defamation suit, how much is this warehouse called Want based on the Amazon system?
Yeah, well, exactly. I couldn't call it Amazon because I knew I'd get in trouble. But during so I was writing this book over the pandemic years. It started as a purely historical fiction novel. I thought I was going to be a really smart writer and turn over a historical fiction in a year, and it was going to be, easy and smart and done. And then we went into lockdown, and I kind of exploded the book because of the connections I started seeing in terms of invisible labour, the workers doing it, and the kind of pressures that they were under. The Amazon warehouse stuff at the same time. There was this explosion in what we were purchasing online, incredible pressure on those warehouses. And then towards the end of the pandemic, all of this kind of very exciting, like flickering of flame in terms of the union movement coming back, particularly in some US Amazon warehouses. And, they bring in there's a HR guy in the book, and they bring in these people that they pretend are HR consultants, but they're union busters. That's what they're there to do. So I actually had quite a lot of fun playing with that, knowing that Amazon won't take any notice of me.
Yeah, he's great. He's, got the top two buttons of his shirt undone, and he's sitting on the edge of the table delivering veiled threats as if he is their pal. And actually reminded me of that film with Frances McDormand, Nomadland, which is about, again, people with limited choices having to work in specific ways. But Kat and Lava are really interesting because they're ordering things online all the time. Yeah. And then suddenly they're also cogs in that machine. There's no escape.
Yeah, and this. I mean, we just hear all this stuff about moral ambiguity today in that, and then today in the crime session as well. And that idea, I don't know if this is something that you feel all the time, Hilary, but that idea that we can be, all for something, all for sustainability and all the rest of it, and then yet when your kid needs a book costume for the day after, and they want the wig that can arrive in 3 hours, it's very hard to resist that option. It's hard to buy the organic meat, and it's out of a lot of people's range when you can buy the cheap shit from Coles. So, I think that point, that kind of itchy, squishy grey point is what really floats my boat in terms of writing it. And that's what I mean when I don't have answers, because I am shining the light on myself as a person who has dubious moral kind of ethics at times too.
Well, what I found really interesting about this was that, yes, it's about systems and kind of those big overarching things that constrain us all. I mean, I am not buying the $12 artisan sourdough in a paper bag. I'm buying the $5 sandwich loaf at Woolies. But all these systems, from the 1930s Meatworks chain to the AI run production line at the Want warehouse, are still subject to human intervention. They can be brought down by humans, which I found very heartening. Is it true, Kate? Is it true?
When I first handed in a version of this novel, and I'm assuming this is, I know there's lots of writers in the audience, and I did hand this in, and then a combination of me needing to explore the book further, and also, to be frank, my then editor saying, yeah, it's not quite what I wanted, because I want the women in the story to rise up and break the factory. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm writing historical fiction, and I've based this on a true strike that happened in 1933, and the women didn't rise up and break the factory. Not only did they not necessarily have the means, they weren't allowed to join the bloody union, and they were busy doing other stuff while the blokes were down at the pub, doing those meetings. And there was something about that feedback that, got on my goat a bit, but also that I realised that I did want the women to rise up in all the ways that women do rise up, which are sometimes very small and gentle and quiet. And they are about doing the things like standing behind friends, which is what Lil does for Peggy in 1933. And they are sometimes, dangerous and violent, and those things as well. Then there's also the way that the kids, the young girls, do it in the far future. And so I wanted to look at the different ways that you can do that.
Yeah, they can be. Those small ways can be dangerous. Taking big steps can be dangerous. Everything about being a woman and making change and taking action can be dangerous. But I found it fascinating too how all these stories are also about women's attitude to resource use. And whether that's collective or individual, how we use what we've got. Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think starting in the 30s, which is where the story started, and the story started in a number of ways through two family connections. One of them is that my family, part of my family, have lived for a long time in Footscray in the west of Melbourne, and my uncle was mayor for a time of that town, and so I got the idea of the story through a story he told me about the old meatworks burning down, and I knew that I wanted to write about women in this place. On the other side of my family, my grandmother grew up in Northgate in a household full of women. And that happened because her father died when she was 18 months old. He was hit by a tram on Ruckers Hill, which is very, very Melbourne. And immediately her aunt moved in. So there were three sisters and, her mother and her aunt. And this idea, and Grandma used to talk about it so much, the idea of this household of women. And the ways in which women protect each other, and in different forms and in different ways of kinship as well. So it's not necessarily family. There are sisters, there's aunts, there's lovers, there's friends. And I think that in a way the resource use, if this is not taking the question too broadly, the resource use is also the use of care and support, and the way in which they do that in all different ways. And then, I had fun with the resource stuff in La and Kat's story, and the kinds of ideas of, fake meat and all those kinds of ideas, and that was really fun to play with too.
Yeah, I mean, these are real characters too. The sisters give each other the shits, and, women are not always nice to each other, and they can care for each other, but also kind of grate against each other in the household. It's very, very relatable. But that future timeline with Maz and Onyx, the sisters who, there's very little left in this world, and they spend their time scavenging, diving far below the surface to get odds from the before times, bits of plastic, anything they can reuse, and they bring it to what looks on the surface like a beautiful collectivist kind of utopia, but it's darker than that, isn't it?
It's really dark. So I had a lot of fun doing spec fic, and I had fun with it in the Mother Fault, partly because I'd done this straight up historical following the skeleton, which is kind of easier in a way because the story's all laid out for you. With spec fic, you get to ask these impossible what if questions and you get to make shit up all the time. It's so much fun. And with this 2181 future, I wanted to move way past the idea of the collapse. And I took Kim Stanley Robinson, who you might have read, his last book is The Ministry of the Future, as inspiration for that, because he talks about, it's not interesting in a way, the collapse. Like, move past that and see what the survivors want to bring forward. So that was really interesting. I knew I wanted young girls to do it. And I thought I'd come up with this very cool idea about a group of people who think that the best way to save the world is for humans to become extinct. I was like, Mildenhall, you've nailed it. This will be ace. Let's go with that. Started doing a little bit of Googling to see what I could put in that. They already exist. There's a whole group of people. I don't know if any of you are members of the Voluntary Extinctionists. You can get a badge if you join up. You just have to say you won't reproduce anymore. So you can do it when you've got kids, but you get the badge. I mean, like, as you deep dive on this stuff, it gets pretty whack. And I needed a few glasses of wine to keep going. But, I mean, this is the stuff that is interesting to me, is that the most interesting stuff, the most bizarre stuff, the most terrible stuff, humans have already come up with that already,
Yeah. I mean, if we go back to the AI bit, because technically this conversation is about progress and AI and things, we will touch on those.
We'll go
it'll be in there, don't worry about it. But I did wonder whether a lot of the problems and oppression in this book and the Mother Fault were about AI or just democratic systems, Are we messing it up?
Yeah, we're messing it up. I get a little passionate about this because, again, didn't mean for this book to come out when the whole world was talking about AI. I had planned to have an algorithm in the book. I'd done it at a much more basic level, kind of. I only realised this after Andy Griffiths has already asked this question in the Treehouse books about what human innovation you would uninvent to fix the world, to make the future of the world better. It has been the best question to ask. I've asked cab drivers, I've asked it at bars. I got my 10-year-old to take it to class and ask this question, and they came up with amazing answers.
Such as?
Well, first, mushrooms, which I couldn't allow because they are not technically a human innovation. But the second one was jail. And like, that hadn't been on my very long list, and that was really extraordinary. So I wanted to create an algorithm, and I wanted a coder to do this for me because it was beyond my capacity, that would allow me to put all this stuff that I'd been reading and this research about criteria of how you would try and work out what was the one innovation that you would uninvent. And I wanted to work out, how you could do that. And I ended up working with an extraordinary woman, Eva Harbridge, who's a visual designer, because she made a diagram that ended up being in the book, much to my delight and my publisher's frustration. But one of the things she talked about, she's deeply into ethical AI. And she talked about the idea of rubbish in, rubbish out. We made it. And it still comes up with, it's not coming up with shitty ideas on its own. It's using our data, the stuff that we came up with. And, there's lots of stuff to explore in the AI conversation. But I think one of the things that was most interesting to me was to look at the fact that the humans make the terrible decisions all throughout the book, all throughout history, and we will continue to make the terrible decisions. And it's sometimes much easier to continue making terrible decisions than to make one little good decision and change the future like that on a pin.
I was really intrigued by that list because there are things you would expect on it, like plastics and cigarettes and things like that. But there's also bras, books,
I mean,
vaccines?
We don't need them. Yeah, vaccines. Controversial. I try and be just slightly provocative when I go in. There's also spam.
Both kinds.
Both kinds, the email and the canned meat, because sidetrack, because I studied meat so much for the abattoir sections, I got very interested in canned meat and spam. They have an Instagram account, which I'm still following, which gives you fancy things to do with spam any day of the week, if anyone needs that in their life. You can look that up. But yeah, you know, the idea of what would happen if we didn't have literacy? What would happen if no one had ever come up with the idea of capital or a system of economics that was anything beyond barter? Like, and these are questions you could make a book out of every single one of those questions, and it's kind of fun in a way just to chuck them all in a list and say, well, have a think about it. You know, have a think about what this could be. And you know, I did actually end up putting that list into ChatGPT. You know, cue horror. So this book has, I don't think there's another book yet on the Australian scene that has a note on the imprint page that says that parts of this book were written with the aid of ChatGPT. And that was partly, again, me being provocative. It was also me making sure I didn't get in trouble. And, you know, we're at this stage where we're talking about this, like how do you talk about, how do we as artists talk about the way in which we use artificial intelligence. But the fun stuff of using ChatGPT for these kinds of questions, it was really incredible for my creative process. So the first question that I asked it was, how would you destroy the world? And ChatGPT is not allowed to answer that question, or it wasn't at that stage, because it's not allowed to tell you how to harm people or animals. But then I thought I would be tricksy with it, and I said that I was a professor, a philosophy professor who was running a scenario with a class, and I needed to come up with 10 different scenarios of how the world might be destroyed. Could it give me that list? Which it could. So I think this idea of, and I don't see that as something inherently dangerous. I see that as a way of us thinking about how to be curious, how to play with the technology in a way that helps us think about the way that we do things as well.
I think it's interesting that you're not frightened by that because I was listening to an ABC podcast called Quick Smart where a producer from Background Briefing said that she'd done a similar exercise. She'd asked ChatGPT how it might hypothetically end a human-like race on an Earth-like planet, because it refused to do this until she did that. And it gave her a list of over 40 ways that it could potentially do that. Resource depletion, biological warfare, targeted bombings. But it said it wouldn't do it without provocation. And she said, what kind of provocation would that be? And she said, a threat to AI. So should we be scared? I mean, is it time to hit abort right now?
Well, I mean, you know, one of the interesting things is that this kind of discussion is now freely available to anyone who wants to log their data into ChatGPT. But those questions, I mean, there's you know, reams of paper and articles that are sitting in high security places that a bunch of mostly older white men sit around talking about all the time. How will we deal with provocation? Like there's lists of ways to do that. So, you know, I think it's scary, but it's also not as scary as we make out to be. And I mean, you know, I spent the afternoon resting and reading Joelle Jurgis in this month's monthly, talking about the summer that is about to come. And Joelle's an extraordinary scientist. She's written an incredible book called Humanity's Moment. She's a scientist who went back to train to write this book to say someone's got to listen to what the scientists are saying about the climate crisis. And you know, that article is terrifying. And that's not got to do with AI. That's got to do with the fact that a whole lot of people know exactly what to do, know exactly that they have the answers, a whole lot of humans, and they're not doing the thing. So I think in that way that sometimes the hubbub around it, and I'm not lessening that at all, but the hubbub around it is misdirection, you know, but it's just making us look at away from the stuff we should be looking at.
Yeah, there was a really interesting moment, wasn't there, where this letter came out from a big group of experts saying, we think AI will turn on us. And the timeline varies. Some of them are saying, it's within 5 to 10 years, and others are like, nah, more like 20, but it will still turn on us. And then, you know, as the months went by, it became clear that people were saying, look, it's actually a problem because we don't know what the code is that goes into it. We don't know the data sets that are being used to program it. And these models are still being pumped out without the transparency in order to make money. So they're out there in the world doing we're not sure what. These are harms that are happening now. And then there's the issue of bias, isn't there? And, inequity in those models.
Yeah. So when you ask ChatGPT about its own bias, it recognises it immediately. It tells you about its biases. And if any of you have read Tracy Spicer's extraordinary book, Man-Made, which came out recently, she's done extraordinary research into the inherent bias within these large language models, which is what ChatGPT is. So this is part of this idea too that, we talk about AI as this enormous thing. And I am no expert. I have literally done this for the book. I'm as much an expert on AI as I am on abattoirs. But, a large language models are one particular thing. There's AI in our GPSs, in our phones, that's other stuff as well. But the idea, now I've just lost where we were talking about.
We're talking about bias,
bias
built in.
Exactly, that's right. So there's all this bias, and yet there was another article that came out, extraordinary professor who'd done this work, looking at HR models that use AI to recruit people. Terrifying, right? Tracy talks about it in Man-Made and says that it can make terrible decisions, and we shouldn't, there's an argument that we should leave it up to the humans. This professor had done a study looking at recruitment in tech, particularly in the recruitment of women, and the AI did a better job of recruiting women to the jobs than the humans did, because the humans were biased. Which we all are. We understand that. But, again, the bias comes in because of the human. So looking at that, the data scraping and where we get that data from, there's one argument, I suppose, where you're like, well, put more data in, put all the data in, put everyone's data in and all of the books and all of the ideas, because at least then that large language model will be more reflective of the society.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you read about some models that are like, well, I looked at all the faces that were tech people and they were guys, white guys. So
exactly.
I just hired white guys. And like, well, yeah, let's look at what we put in.
Yeah, that's what the humans do too.
Yeah. I want to go back a little bit to the idea of how convenient our lives are and how convenient they need to be. Because I think of the Matrix, everyone's just sleeping quietly in their little bubbles of amniotic fluid, because it's easy and they're having these lovely lives in their head. And it reminds me of The Mother Fault, where Mim, the mother, realises at one point that she's been protecting her kids from the wrong things, from things that they need to deal with, like risk and independence and hard work. And her kids just thrive when they can do that. Do you think our lives need to be harder?
Oh, do our lives need to be harder? I think it's such a tricky question, because part of me wants to go, yes, of course. I want my kids to never ask for a phone or a screen again, and I want it to be high risk, and I want them to do all those things. And yet, I look at those years, the 1930s that I studied for Footscray, and I'm like, I don't want in any way to go back there. And there was this sense when I was looking at the historical archive, which is what I did for the 30s section, a whole lot of interviews with meat workers, and they talked about the glory and the honour of doing that work, of being trained as a slaughterman, and of doing the work doing it very well, of coming through generations of meat workers, and then this terrible kind of humiliation of the chain when it came in. And the chain is the system that came out of Chicago. It's what Henry Ford, used for the car factories when he looked at the meat factories in Chicago and looked at them disassembling animals, and he reversed it to assemble the cars. And of course, in one sense, that chain coming in destroyed livelihoods. It changed the face of abattoirs and meatworks forever. It made meat cheaper and easier to get. It also made it cleaner and safer. Again, on the other hand, it made COVID very easy to be passed between meat workers when we all kept wanting to have our meat during lockdown. And this is part of the whole reason that I exploded the novel into something bigger, because I couldn't decide what was the better thing. And the question that I was asking as a writer was, if that strike had have been successful in Footscray in 1933, and by some miracle the chain never got introduced into abattoirs ever across the world, and they were still, one man, one beast is what they used to call it. Like, what would it look like now? What kinds of changes would we have in our society, and would they be for better or for worse?
Yeah, I was at one point reading this book and thinking, is this a Marxist book? I mean, there's a lot of scrutiny of the profit motive and the damage it can do. But again, there's a lot of kind of showing of the intricacy of how an economy works and how, craft and skill can be in different places. I did also think about it kind of triggered me a little bit about the lockdowns, partly about all the online shopping, this is mindless online shopping that I was doing, and clicking terms of service that I had not properly read. And the awful situation of people like Hilda, the elderly woman who's kind of collapsing into her memories in aged care in one of the timelines. What do you think the way we behaved during the worst of COVID says about us as a species?
Well, I mean, one of the things that really started me writing Hilda's story, partly was my grandmother who died last year and was sick during that time, and we had the great kind of honour of nursing her at home, which was an honour, not because we didn't know that she would be beautifully looked after. I've got lots of nurses in the family and healthcare workers. But the terrible fear that I know many people had of not being able to see their loved ones. And I think the frustration too, I mean, you ask what was the worst of us during that time? And I think one of the things I remember so clearly reading an article or hearing on talkback at some stage, people being so angry at a breakout of COVID in an aged care home, which had been caused by a PCA worker who had come from another place, who was working a double shift, which they had to work. They had to work triple shifts because there was no staff to work those shifts. There was no proper protection. The details that I've got in there about nurses being asked to do double shifts to look after 70, 80 clients, that detail about going onto shift and there being one glove for the whole unit to use and share, they're real. I didn't make those details up. And I had the whole section checked by a gorgeous writer, Sam Coley, who worked in HR in New South Wales during this time. And I think the other thing, Hilary, that was inescapable for me looking at this, the physical kind of idea of the chain, was looking at aged care as a chain of the profit that comes out of it, of this kind of idea that, they weren't seen as clients at all, the people who were living in there. And a couple, my best friend read the book and she said, you really don't care what people think about you anymore, do you? You put a lot of rage into this. And it didn't feel like rage when I was writing it, but I can see how it looks like rage now on the page. And I don't think that I had rage for any one group in particular. I mean, the system sucked. The government was forced to do things it didn't want to do. Healthcare workers were forced to do things they didn't want to do. Families were. But Hilda was, this kind of beautiful character who I could put at the centre of that, a woman who is trying to remember her whole life and trying to acknowledge that whole life, which was very much for my grandmother, in the face of a place that is kind of forgetting her.
And remembering a life that was hedged around with rules about what women could and couldn't do and various other constraints that afflict us all, but also who had found some ways through that. Actually, like water, it reminded me of the river, which is a thread that runs through this book and the different timelines. I wanted to mention too, I feel like the book is about huge change, the potential for huge change and actual change, but it also suggests that a few things about human nature might stay constant. So there's violence and greed and narcissism, but there's also kindness and love and altruism. What are your thoughts about whether we as a species are capable of huge change in the way we are and whether we need to?
I think we are capable of it. And a dear friend did an event with me recently, Penny Russin, who's a beautiful writer, and we were talking about the difference between what we're often taught as writers, which is that our books or plots revolve around conflict, and the idea that you can shift that and make the book or a story revolve around care, which I think is a really powerful kind of idea. But also I think, that idea of kindness and our capacity for change. I read a remarkable book by a woman called Jane McGonigal, and it's called Imaginable. And she's a futurist, and she does this large-scale scenario thinking stuff for like NASA and governments across the world, where she plays the what-if game, basically. Hayley referred to, the what-if game we play as fiction writers today. And this idea is that, you flip the question on its head and you say, well, what if we can, reverse the climate crisis in 50 years? What would that look like? Let's think up, brainstorm 100 ways we could do that, and then work back from that. And her idea, different to what I've had done in therapy or which other people might have been, which is don't imagine the worst, because if you imagine the worst, your whole body experiences that worst. You don't want to put your body through that. And she's like, no, imagine the worst and also imagine the best, and then work backwards from there and see how you got there. And I think that was kind of an infectious idea to play with in the book, which was to think about if we'd reversed or flipped any of these moments, if you hadn't met the bloke, the dashing, charming Jack, or at one stage one of the characters wishes that she could unconceive her pregnancy, not in that way of fully reversing it, just to see what that new avenue would have. And that was, I think, not fear as much that was driving those questions, or a fear about what we're capable of, but a kind of an optimism, I think. Yeah.
I'm going to try and leave a bit of time at the end for questions, because I feel like that would be pretty interesting to hear what you have to ask Kate Mildenhall. But I want to get through a couple of things before then. Let's go back to the river for a moment, because it feels at some moments, because nature crops up in different ways in all these stories, it's like this little oasis where Jack and Peggy go to make out, which is a beautiful little kind of narrative hiatus point. There's the bits where Maz and Onyx dive, and the mountain that people go to, and the caves they live in, all these kind of natural areas. And then there's the river that just kind of makes a narrative of its own through all these stories. Are you seeing that as a kind of optimistic feature? Is that meant to say to us nature will endure?
Yeah, I got, during the writing of The Mother Fault, I got really into reading geology, and so much so that I went back and did a first-year subject, just sat in, like I got permission, but I didn't pay for it. I sat in and listened to these first-year geology lectures, and that idea of deep time, and that kind of, it can be frightening, and I know that it's sometimes used by people who look at deep time by saying, we're just a blip, climate crisis isn't real because we're just this much in, the epochs of time. And I certainly don't share that view. But this idea of, that moment, which any locals I'm sure have, when you go out and, life is shit, but that ocean out there just keeps rolling in. The tide does not care. And it keeps coming, and it will keep coming on the shittest of days, and when there is apocalypse and all those things, and so there is something comforting in that. And I'm also, I'm not a nature writer by any means, but I love the work of our Australian nature writers in particular, and I think that there has to be some calm and breathing space for your reader, and the joy, and I think quiet kind of peace that I find in writing the natural world was really always there. I read a lot of post-human landscape stuff, and there's also a bit that I watched with my kids in that last Attenborough, whichever one, I can't remember, his witness statement to the world, and he films that last part in a place, I can't remember which one it is, but where the jungle has come back. It's grown over the city. And there is a kind of an optimism in that. It will come back. It will come back when we're gone. And for all that we stuff it up, it will endure. And that idea of the river being there and being far, far wiser than any AI or any human was intoxicating to write.
Well, it almost felt like a gesture towards the First Peoples too. It's like, even if all the people are gone, the stories might still be there. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. The stories will be there. That idea of a deep, deep belonging to place will be there and will endure. And interestingly, that river section, originally it was from the perspective of a very, very old fish. And it stuck out like a sore thumb because I had it even at this, when I'd written this very kind of straight historical fiction narrative. And my agent kind of said, I like it. It's a bit odd. It doesn't really sit in there. And it was one of those ones, writers will know this feeling when you're like, no, that is staying. Like I am keeping that. That section will stay. But it allowed, I really liked being able to begin and end with the voice of the river, about amid the hubble and bubble of the silly humans in the book and the beautiful humans, that the river is the thing that finishes and brings it home.
Yeah. It made me think of that A.D. Hope line in The Death of the Bird, the great earth with neither grief nor malice accepts the tiny burden of her death. And it was like, this is a thing that has no human emotions but can tell a story like nobody's business. Yeah. So, Kate, what would progress look like to you?
Hilary, question without notice. My goodness, what would progress look like? I think
it's in the brief.
I know it is in the brief. It's true, but it's such a big question. And I wrote this book. It took me 4 years, and I still don't have an answer. I think the little things actually is where progress looks like something to me. So that idea of the quiet and the gentle rebellion, as much as the big rebellion, certainly. Maz and Onyx, these girls at the end of the book, they're written for my kids. My kids are 10 and 12, and they are fierce and extraordinarily frustrating, but they are incredibly determined. And I think they are, part of an extraordinary movement of youth who just look at us grown-ups sometimes and are like, what are you doing? Like, you have more power than we do and you get to make decisions. What are you doing? And I think that listening to them and listening to a lot of voices is what's so important. One of the epigraphs for this book is from a book by Lydia Yuknovich, who's a US writer, and she recently released a book called Thrust. And I got permission from her to use one of her last lines in the book, which says, "You can't kill the future in us." And it's written from the perspective of a child. And I think that, I suppose the idea of progress for me is that hope on the everyday that we can make a difference. And I mean, I don't know if there's anyone in the audience here who were part of the brilliant Yes group who were standing outside opposite the library, this morning, little conversations, little listenings, and thinking that those things have the capacity to make big difference. I think that's maybe my idea of progress.
I love that idea, and I would love to take your questions too. Stick a hand up and I'll point at you randomly, and then you can shout up your question at Kate Mildenhall if you have one.
Come at me.
It took you 4 years to write the book. Does some of that stuff happen just not when you're formally doing it, but like in the middle of the night, or you're walking, or doing the dishes or stuff like that?
Yeah, great question. I wish more of it happened when I did the dishes, because I do a lot of dishes. Certainly the first part was quite quick, and then I exploded the stupid thing and I had to put it all back together, which is what took a lot of time. Because my first book came out when my kids were really little, so I've always written with that kind of pressure of them and work, etc. So I'm what I call, and Cheryl Strayed calls, a binge writer, in that I go away when I can for a week or so and do an extraordinary amount of work. And it's partly because I can stay in the work. So I, wake up in the morning and I go to bed thinking about it, and obviously drink wine and, read and do all those other things. But I think for me that's where I get enormous amount of work done. I think Catherine Kovacic was talking today about the idea of, that sometimes you're going on this straight line towards the end of your narrative, and then your character says, take a left turn, and then you go off and you spend, I don't know, you could spend an hour there, or you can spend months in the wrong direction. And what I think for me retreating is so good for is that I don't spend quite so long in the wrong direction, and that I can get that crazy idea in my mind, walk it out, have an extra cup of coffee, and then go, okay, no, Kate, that was a bit loose. Let's get back onto what we were doing. So that's partly how it works for me. Having said that, I don't get away that much. So 7-minute exercises is my new trick. So I set the timer on my phone for 7 minutes. I'm not allowed to get up during that time. I know that I can write till the end of 7 minutes, even if it kills me sitting there to do 7 minutes. Sometimes I do more than that. Sometimes I only just get to it and then I go and do the dishes. But that's proved very useful. And in fact, Pip Williams, who I'm sure many of you know, the writer of The Lost Dictionary, she was on the First Time podcast, which I co-produce recently, and she said she's brought her daily word count down to 1 word. That's what she finds is the best for the least pressure, because she can definitely do 1 word.
Anything beyond 1 is a massive victory. Yeah. Yep, over here.
I'm very curious about your absolutely beautiful, mind-blowing writing of sex. And I see that Helen Elliott this morning said that you have a gift.
Wasn't that lovely?
Tonight. And I'm just wondering, how do you do it? Because it's so hard to write good sex. Do you labour over it, or do you get inspired by someone? Or it just seems like it just flows out of you.
It's like a planted question, isn't it? Were you inspired by someone when you were writing the sex? Obviously can't reveal that in this place, but thank you. And that was a delightful note. You never want to get in the bad sex awards. Like, that is not something you're aiming to do as a writer. Another person that I got to interview for the podcast is Chris Neen, who's an extraordinary Australian writer. And, in the podcast, they were talking about this idea that, you have to kind of physically embody it. And sometimes that means, and my editor told me this, which is extraordinary. So as an editor, when she's editing sex scenes, she stands up and kind of acts them out and moves them around, because sometimes the hand just cannot go to that place when you are in a certain position. So that's what she does. One of the things that I have tried to do is to write good sex, because there's a lot of bad sex in the world in general, and there's a lot of bad sex on the page, and I just don't need to put much more of that into the world, I don't think. So I try and make it good, and punctuation gets in the way both of writing sex and, I'd argue, the act of sex as well. So I think that making it as much as possible, taking punctuation out, has helped me. I don't know if that will help you, but try it. Oh. Yes. Oh, that's lovely.
Well,
can someone write that down so I can add it to something? Thank you.
I felt the same about The Mother Fault. The sex scene in that was fantastic. Yeah, though it was very disconcerting in The Hummingbird Effect that the same kind of lack of punctuation and stream of consciousness effect happened in the government speak bits about the lockdown and the sex scene.
I do not find government speak sexy. I will say that.
Horrific. Another question? Yep, up here.
Sort of related question to do with AI. When I was a lot younger, AI meant something completely different. Artificial insemination. Is there any way that you may be able to use both lots of AI in any of your work?
Well, interesting. I mean, like
Kat's story kind of has that frisson in there. I must say, some of the research about that I did to do with IVF and egg freezing is extraordinary, and that's not my lived experience, and I did get other people to read those sections for me and check them. But one of the things that Jane McGonigal recommends is, if you're interested in the potential progress in any particular idea, that just Googling future of and the thing that you're interested in is extraordinary. And so I played with that idea, future of IVF, future of meat, weird, future of fake meat, weirder, and just played with that. And that's just as an exercise as a human, that's really interesting.
We may have time for one more quick question if there is one. No? All right. Oh, my God. Oh, yes. Here we go. Eve, hello.
Thanks, Kate, for a great conversation. You know, as well as being an amazing novelist, you give so much to the literary community in this country, including through hosting your wonderful podcast, The First Time. I'd love to hear your reflections on how your conversations with other writers kind of feeds into your own writing practice.
Thank you. That's a beautiful question, and right back at you with being a good industry citizen. The podcast has been like doing an informal PhD. You know, honestly, it's been going for 6 years now. I've got to speak to people that I only ever dreamed I would even be in the same room as. This year I've interviewed Winton, and I've interviewed Helen Garner and Christos Cholkas, as well as an extraordinary range of brand new novelists that I would not necessarily have picked up their work straight away. And I think that the biggest thing that I've learned is there is no right way to do it. You know, and the extraordinary idea of hearing different writers come at things in completely different ways. You know, I need a whole day to write. I need 1 minute to write. I'm a plotter. I'm a pantser. You know, I don't believe in the publishing system, and I just want to put my work out, and I don't need anyone to read it. Versus, you know, there is no point doing this thing if you don't have readers to read it. Like having all of those positions and having these kind of conversations, which you would know too, Hilary, from your work, these intimate conversations where often people get off the phone or the call and go, I cannot believe I said that to you. Like, I don't know where that came from. Can we edit that out? And then they take that back and we leave it in. It's such an honour. It truly is such an honour. And the connections and knowing that as a community, as a community of writers, we are so incredibly diverse, and we do so much different writing, but this kind of deep respect for the work itself, I think that's what's been my greatest lesson from it. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for such great questions and such great attentiveness. Kate Mildenhall is going to be signing books in the foyer. You should buy all 3. Why not? Kate, thanks so much for being such a generous and fascinating interviewee.
Thank you so much, Hilary, and thank you all for coming.